Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. So this is our third installment of the Arctic Marine Life course. And Canada is an Arctic nation, yet only a small percentage of Canadians live there. So how do people living in southern parts of Canada, or anywhere in the world for that matter, learn about the unique and fascinating marine animals that inhabit this enigmatic environment? Well, let me present to you the online Arctic Marine Life course. This course is supported by the Science in Canada's North Café Scientifique series. We would like to acknowledge the support of the W. Garfield Weston Foundation and the Canadian Association of Science Centres for their support. Our partners include the Alliance of Natural History Museums of Canada, Canada's Accredited Zoos and Aquarium, Telespark in Calgary, Canadian Museum of Nature in Ottawa, and the Discovery Centre in Halifax. If you'd like to keep track of the dates and locations of the presentations on our website, it's www.vanaqua.org/Arctic Marine Life course. If you miss a presentation, you can always watch it online after it has been recorded. If you have any questions about the course or would like to register for the course, you can contact Jonathan Hildquist at vanaqua.org. Our first speaker tonight is PhD candidate Benjamin Scheifele from the University of British Columbia's Department of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. Benjamin's research focuses on using marine robot technology to measure small-scale fluctuations in ocean velocity and temperature in the Canadian Arctic. His presentation will focus on ocean currents in the Arctic Ocean. Without further ado, Benjamin Scheifele. Thank you.
Okay, is this working? Perfect. Hi, and thank you for coming out on this blistery night one more time. I'm Benjamin, and I'm here to talk to you about Arctic Ocean circulation. So I am what's called a physical oceanographer. Okay, try that again. Okay, I am Benjamin, and I am a physical oceanographer, which means essentially two things. It means I study the dynamics of the ocean, and it means I study the thermodynamics of the ocean. So, are we still missing sound? Keep going? Okay. So, I study the dynamics and the thermodynamics. So, the dynamics means I study anything that moves in the ocean, and the thermodynamics means I study anything that's related to heat and salt and density and those things, and they drive motion in the ocean. So those two things are very related to each other. Specifically, I study mixing and turbulence in the Arctic, so that's my specialty. And I am working on my PhD at UBC, and from time to time, I will take on courses at UBC and teach some courses at UBC as well. Now, a fair question that you might ask yourself is why I'm here talking to you about ocean circulation when you signed up for an Arctic Marine Life course. And I hope that by the end of this short lecture, you'll be able to answer that question yourself. To start asking that question, it starts with this picture. So I'm going to put it up here, and I won't explain what it is now, but I'll get you to try and think about what you think it could be. So this is a map, of course. Blue means low concentration, green is medium, red is high concentration. And we'll come back to what this is, but I just want you to have this picture in your head as we walk through here and see if you can take a guess and figure out what this is. Now, it's probably fair to say that most people, when they think of Arctic marine life, will think of large mammals, right? So it starts with polar bears, ringed seals, or beluga whales. But the important thing to recognize is that these mammals that we're looking at, they sit at the top of a very large food chain, and they're sitting at the very top of it. And there's a whole pyramid underneath it that supports these mammals that we sort of use to exemplify Arctic marine life. But they're not Arctic marine life on their own. There's a lot that goes below this, right? So you can think about each of those animals. They sit at the highest trophic level, and they have to eat something, right? So sitting below on the next step down would be Arctic cod. Sitting far down below there, we have different you can trace the trophic levels down. Let's see if this works. Here we go. Right, so you've got polar bears, you've got seals, you've got larger fish, you've got smaller fish, you've got smaller fish, one eats the other, and so on. And you trace it all the way down till we get to the smallest animals, which are these beautiful creatures, which if you've gone swimming in the ocean, you've probably eaten, to be fair. You can tell they're the smallest, let's say, animals that swim in the ocean. They're defined, so we call them zooplankton. They're defined by the characteristic that they can't swim against the current. They're the smallest grazers in the ocean. But these guys themselves also have to eat something, and they eat what we call phytoplankton. So these are small marine, these are single-celled marine plants, marine organisms that photosynthesize, which means they produce oxygen. They need sunlight and they use carbon dioxide and they produce oxygen. So here we go. So you may have gotten here by now and figured out that the map that I was showing you at the beginning, this is a map of chlorophyll A concentration, which is basically a map of phytoplankton growth. So we can use chlorophyll A as a proxy for phytoplankton growth. And the thing to realize here is that phytoplankton sit at the very bottom of this food chain. They support everything else that sits above them. So zooplankton, smaller fish, larger fish, mammals, everything sits above the food chain. So when I think of marine life, I think of this image more than I think of anything else. Because this image, what's on here, supports everything else that sits above it. Now, this picture, of course, is taken in a North American summer, right? I can tell because, North American late spring or early summer, southern hemisphere winter, because concentrations of plant life, right, grow in the spring and in the summer. Incidentally, and it's just an interesting fact, is phytoplankton produce somewhere in the vicinity of 70% of the oxygen that you and I breathe. Right? So they're a huge part of not only ocean ecology, but also of your and my everyday life. And I still haven't explained what this has to do with what I study. So I study ocean currents and ocean dynamics. And these two things are very related, and I want you to see the connection between them. So, phytoplankton are plants, which means they photosynthesize, which means they create oxygen using carbon dioxide. Okay, so many of you, not all of you, but many of you will have seen something like this. This is just, you don't need to remember this. It's just a very simple equation for how photosynthesis works. It means we need carbon dioxide, we need water, and we can produce sugar, which just means, biological matter in this case. And oxygen here is the important one that we care about. But there are two other things that go into making plant life work. Right? So photosynthesis, the first is we need light. Photosynthesis requires light. But what else is missing here? So if you're a gardener, think about what's missing in this equation. Let's say you take a large plant, put it in a small pot, and you water it faithfully for years. It will eventually die. Why? Any takers? Say again? Yeah, right? So plants, like anything else, need nutrients to grow. So what's missing in this equation, it's not really missing, it's not in this equation, but also essential to phytoplankton growth, are nutrients. Specifically, we need nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. There's a whole list of nutrients, some more important than others. But those nutrients get used up as phytoplankton grow, and typically within any region, when there's a large phytoplankton bloom, within the span of one spring, the nutrient content in a certain region, so let's say the Strait of Georgia, will be used up over the course of a spring. Right? So then we have no more nutrients, and they need to come from somewhere. So those nutrients that allow all this to happen, they need to be replenished. And that is where we need to start thinking about the ocean as a dynamic thing. So we no longer can think about the world ocean as the static thing that doesn't move. We have to think about it as a dynamic object that brings with it and transports nutrients, heat, salt, all these things. Specifically, the fact that the ocean moves, and this is actually a really cool visualization. It's produced by NASA. And it's just global surface currents. The fact that the ocean moves facilitates an exchange between what happens at the surface of the ocean and what happens in the deep. So at the surface, we have photosynthesis, which is what we've been talking about. Photosynthesis uses up carbon dioxide. It creates oxygen, but it depletes nutrients, right, in the ocean. So on its own, it's only one side of the picture, right? Somewhere else, something else has to happen, and that other thing that happens is decay. It's the decay of organic matter, the decay of fish that die, the decay of whales that die, the decay of phytoplankton that die, right? Over time, those things will die, sink into the deep ocean, and then given time, they will decay or remineralize. And that decay, organic decay, as you know, produces nutrients and puts those nutrients back into the ocean. That process, however, depletes oxygen. So we have this exchange of two processes. We have photosynthesis, which depletes nutrients but creates oxygen. And we have remineralization, which depletes oxygen but reintroduces nutrients into the ocean. And those two things happen in different places in the ocean. Right? Photosynthesis happens near the surface where you have sunlight. Remineralization happens in the deep water after long periods of time. And you need to exchange between those two mechanisms in order for this whole system to continue to work. So that's one of the major reasons why we care about ocean dynamics and ocean circulation. So that's the biological reason. There's also a physical reason. The physical reason is because our oceans transport an immense amount of heat along with the atmosphere. So let me expand on that just a little bit. So this is another map, another world map, and it's a map of sea surface temperature. This is what the ocean's temperature looks like. And as you would expect, right, you have high temperatures near the equator, and as you move towards the poles, you get colder temperatures. Fair enough. I'll come back to that in a second. So the reason for that, of course, is because the equator faces the sun more directly, so it absorbs more solar radiation. Now, the Earth, our planet, is in what we call a radiative balance, or it's close to a radiative balance, in that it absorbs the same amount, that it absorbs a certain amount of energy from the sun, but it has to radiate that energy back out, right? So if you picture the Earth as this, let's say, reservoir of energy, if I'm putting energy into it from the sun, if I'm not taking energy out, the Earth would be continually getting warmer, right? So the same amount of energy that I'm putting into the Earth has to be coming back out of it somehow, radiating away from it. It happens in different wavelengths of light, but if you sum up the total amount of energy, it's the same. Now, if you look at the net radiation of the Earth, because the equator faces the sun more directly, right, we have a net absorbance of radiation near the equators, but we have a net deficit of radiation, or we have a net leaving of radiation at the poles. So what this is saying is that we're absorbing heat at the equator, we're losing it at the poles, but in order for that to happen, we have to transport heat from the equator to the poles. So the poles are like these big waving flags that just radiate energy out from the Earth. And to do that, to move energy from here to here, we have two mechanisms that do it. One is the ocean and one is the atmosphere. So ocean circulation, atmospheric circulation. And the amount of heat that we're moving, so this is what's called the thermohaline circulation. Many of you will have seen a diagram like this before, and it's just a large-scale global oceanic circulation. And the same idea is here. You're absorbing heat here, and then as water sinks here, it releases heat to the atmosphere, and as water sinks at the pole here, it releases heat to the atmosphere, and that heat is then free to radiate out away from the Earth. But the amount of heat that is being transported from the pole across the tropics from the equator across the tropics to the pole is an immense, mind-boggling amount of heat. So as a rough figure, we can think of 3 petawatts, which is a 3 with 15 zeros behind it. Just sort of to put that number into context, that's roughly, so I'm sort of pulling, these are pretty rough numbers, right? But roughly 100 to 300 times the entire human global energy consumption, right? Averaged across the planet. Okay, so just to give you a concept for how much heat we're actually transporting from here to here. So that's the physical reason for why we study ocean circulation. Okay, so now let's get a little bit more specific, right, and think about the Arctic. So this is a map of the Arctic Ocean. So this is just a map of the world, probably a map that you're not very familiar with looking at, but if you grab a globe, right, and turn it on its head and look at it from above, this is what you should see. Okay, so we have, right, this up over here is Canada. This big thing here of ice, this is Greenland. Baffin Island, Ellesmere Island, these are names you've probably heard before. This whole thing here, this is all Russia. All of this is Russia. We have Norway and Sweden. And then in the ocean, here we have, this is the North Atlantic, right? The Pacific is just through here. This is the Bering Strait. Alaska's right here. This is what we call the Canada Basin, and this is the Eurasian Basin. Okay? Now, the main thing I want you to recognize, looking just at the bathymetry here, is as with any ocean basin, there are two components. You have the shelves. So these are the shallow parts that are surrounding, adjacent to the continent. And they're actually part of the continents. They're just submerged. And these, in this case here, we're at about 200 meters depth. And then in the central ocean, we have the deep ocean basins. And these go between about 4,000 and 4,500 meters, right? Or about 4.5 kilometers deep. And then the other feature that's important to notice is this ridge that runs along here, which is another mid-ocean ridge. There's a similar one running down the Atlantic Ocean. And these have important consequences for the circulation and defining what the types of water masses are that make it into the different basins here. Okay, now, of course, most of the year, if you were to look down on the Earth doesn't actually look like this, right? It will look like this. And it's dark. But for most of the year, the ocean looks like this. So this is 2015. I think it's February, what's the date here? February 25th, 2015. And that was the maximum ice extent this year. So that's what the world looked like on February 25th, 2015. It's actually the smallest maximum ice extent we have on record. Let's see what else I have here. In the summer, it looks like this. You can see that you still have a large portion of the Arctic covered with sea ice, although it's quite a bit smaller than the median. So this was this summer as well. This was September 2015, September 11th, I think, which was the minimum ice this year, was on September 11th. And you can see the minimum this year is quite a bit lower than the median over the last 30 years here, the medium minimum over the last 30 years. So it's just to give you an idea of, right, I show you this map, but of course there's ice sitting over top of it. But we're going to ignore that because the ocean and ocean circulation still happens underneath all that ice, which is why I'm ignoring a lot of what's going on there. Okay, so if we look at the Arctic Ocean circulation, there are two main features that define what's going on. I'm just going to go back one slide here. Right, you don't need to be an oceanographer to notice two things. To notice that the Arctic Ocean is connected to the Atlantic here with a relatively deep and relatively wide connection, and it's connected to the Pacific here through a relatively small and relatively shallow connection. Right? And so the water that is in here will have characteristics of water that is entered in from the Atlantic and water that is entered in from the Pacific. So if you look at the circulation in the Arctic, you can see, so there's a bit of a complicated figure. Right? The red arrows represent water that's coming in from the Atlantic. Yellow arrows represent water that's coming in from the Pacific. And the general patterns that happen is that you get this counterclockwise circulation that happens along the edges between the ocean shelf and the ocean basin. Right, so you have water that comes in from the Atlantic and tends to circulate along these basins here, sometimes splitting, usually splitting at the junction with these ridges that go in the middle here. So you get this sort of general counterclockwise rotation of ocean currents here and here. Now in the Eurasian basin, you only have Atlantic water signatures. In the Canadian basin, or the Beaufort Sea, so this is where we are up here, right? You get both Atlantic water and Pacific water, which will be at the shallower, one, right? It's coming in at shallower depths. Okay, so now when I'm talking about ocean circulation, the thing I'm talking about more than anything is about the modification of water masses, right? So from the first 10 minutes of our presentation, right, we established that the things that are really important is how we're modifying water, how we're bringing nutrients to different regions, how we're transporting heat. And so to talk just about ocean currents is a little bit too narrow. Actually, what we really need to talk about is any process that affects or modifies a water mass. And there's a whole bunch of them. So currents is one of them, right? You can see it right here. But really, there's a whole array of them that you have to think about. You can think, and we could talk about any one of them. We could talk about Ekman transport. You can see the wind has a big effect. You have precipitation. You have the sun coming in, heating up stuff. You have rivers coming in. All these things affect the properties of, in this case, we're talking about the Arctic, so Arctic Ocean, and set the context under which all this biology happens. There's this interaction with topography here. You have waves that happen in the middle of the ocean. Many people don't know about internal waves. So what I study is, I study the rates at which these different mechanisms modify water masses. We call that the rate of mixing, or how quickly water masses mix. The different mechanisms that happen, it's kind of interesting to look at a picture like this and think about and realize the many different scales that are involved in what's going on. So it takes a little bit of getting used to. This is if you've never seen it before, this is a log scale, which is tricky to read, right? But this is a time scale here, and it ranges from 1 second, a minute, an hour, a day, all the way up to 1,000 years. And the length scales here vary all the way from a centimeter all the way up to 1,000 kilometers, right? And it's basically just mapping out these different processes that all happen simultaneously in the ocean, the different scales on which they happen, right? So if we talk about the thermohaline circulation, a picture of which I showed you near at the start, you can see, right, thermohaline circulation happens on time scales of about 1,000 years and on space scales of about 1,000 kilometers. That's the scale that you need to consider when you talk about thermohaline circulation. If you're talking about internal waves, you're talking about scales of about a day or a kilometer. Right? If you're talking about surface waves, the waves that we see on the surface of the ocean here, right? These are wind sea waves. We're looking at frequencies of about a second, right? And length scales of about a meter. That should be things we can relate to. What I study is I study the very smallest scale. I study turbulence, which is the breaking, and the turbulence is the nonlinear part of motion. It's sort of like if you've ever seen, a car in a wind tunnel, like images of a car in a wind tunnel, or an airplane in a wind tunnel. On the tail end of it, there are all these little turbulent motions that happen on space scales of seconds and centimeters, and those are the ones that I study. So the question is, oh, wait, let's go. Okay, so here we go. So let's go back to this picture here, and let's go into the Canadian Arctic, right along here by the edge of the Beaufort Sea. And let's take some measurements here, right where the little star is. I'm going to measure the temperature. Okay. Now remember, you have two characteristics. You have characteristics of the Atlantic water and characteristics of Pacific water in the Canadian Arctic. The Atlantic water is deeper and it's warmer. So all of this here, sorry, if you haven't seen this before, this is a depth plot right here. So this is just the depth of the ocean, right? And this is the temperature. Okay, so you can see the temperature varies between about -2 and 1 degree Celsius. But you can see right at the surface, we have quite, well, near the surface at about 100 meters depth or 300 feet depth. You have pretty cold water, relatively. And then you've got this big bulge of warm water that goes all the way down to about 1,800 meters. So all of this heat here, this is all signature of heat that's coming in from the Atlantic. Okay, but stuck right above it, layered above it, is this layer of Pacific water here, which is colder. Just show you. If you measure the salinity, like this is the same picture except I'm plotting salinity instead of temperature. You can see that the Atlantic water is also much saltier. The Pacific water is less salty, which is why the Atlantic water stays deeper down. Now, so you have all this heat trapped here, and it may not look like a lot just if you don't have a context for it, but if you can imagine taking this temperature gradient here and integrating it over the full 1,800 meters, and there's a lot of heat that's trapped in this area here, and it's trapped below 100 meters depth in the Arctic. And in fact, if you were to integrate and calculate how much heat you actually have in this temperature profile, you'd have enough heat to melt the entire winter Arctic ice, sea ice. So that picture I showed you of Canada this fall, this past winter in February, where the entire Arctic was covered in sea ice. This heat that's trapped here, if you were to take it and move it to the surface, you would melt all of that ice. Okay, so that is the reason, not that we want to do this, right, but we want to understand how much of this heat gets transported through this interface here and towards the surface, and how much of this heat is contributing to melting sea ice. So that's the motivation for studying mixing in the context that I study it in. Okay, so how do we study mixing in the Arctic Ocean? Well, the answer is we study it by measuring, well, one way of studying it is by measuring small-scale fluctuations in velocity in the Arctic. And when I say small scale, I mean centimeter scale, right? So some very small second scale, centimeter scale fluctuations in the speed of the water give us an estimate of how quickly the ocean is mixing, in this case vertically. So these are complicated measures of mixing, but let's just take them as proxies for how quickly we are moving properties up and down in the water column, right? So red is a certain amount of mixing that happens, the orange line is more mixing that happens, and the blue line is more mixing that happens. And so the general pattern here is that you end up with lower mixing rates in regions where you have smooth topography, right? Higher mixing rates in regions where you have rough topography. This is the ocean bottom. And the most amount of vertical mixing up and down happens in regions where you have mid-ocean ridges. Okay, so these measurements were all taken at different points in this map. You're actually looking at the blue and the green parts of this map. It's where these measurements were taken. So this is sort of some sort of a global average of how quickly mixing modifies water masses. And what I'm trying to do at UBC with a bunch of other people is produce similar images for the Arctic Ocean. So this is the ocean's topography. So this is what I was referring to when I was talking about different types of topography, right? So you can see there are regions where you have smooth topography, right? Regions where you've got rougher topography, things look crazier, and regions where you have these mid-ocean ridges here, right? And so you have these three different types of regions in which you can get different mixing rates, and so these are regions where water masses are modified more quickly between the surface and the deep, right? And so we're trying to get similar pictures to this in the Arctic Ocean. Okay, so the way this is normally done is, actually I'm just going to go back 2 slides quickly. The way this is normally done is with these really sensitive probes that we stick onto an instrument and let fall through the water column. And so what we're doing at UBC is we're trying to take those probes and mount them on it's like a robotic submarine. So it's a robotic, what we call a glider. It's about the size of a person, right? And it looks like a torpedo, it's not. And on top of it, we strap these little instruments here, which measure centimeter scale fluctuations in the ocean in order to get these mixing rates. So I had the privilege, oh well, actually, before we get there, I'll just explain quickly how this happens. So we drop these guys in the water, and they are fully robotic, so they go by themselves. And they'll stay underwater for up to about 24 hours. They'll be collecting data the whole way, and then they'll come up to the surface, radio home, give us a location where they are, and a subset of the data, and then continue on their path. And so they'll be in the water for about 2 weeks or so. 2 weeks to a few months, depending on what you're doing with them. Now, I had the privilege this summer of going to the Beaufort Sea with the Canadian Coast Guard, and we deployed one of these. This was our first deployment in the Arctic, right here in the Beaufort Sea. And so you can just sort of see, this is the Canadian Coast Guard icebreaker. It's the flagship icebreaker, the Amundsen. And we were on there for 2 weeks, and you can see here we are just lowering it down off the side of the ship, bringing it down onto the marine barge, and here playing with it off of the barge. So this is actually a picture of the recovery right at the end of our cruise, and here's a picture of the cruise track. And I think with that, we're just about out of time, so I'm going to cut it there and say thank you. And I guess I'll answer any questions if you have any. Yep.
Have you had a chance to look at any of your data yet from this summer?
So we're working on it. Yeah, so we got a lot of data. So we ended up with, I think you end up with about, the instrument samples at around 500 hertz, which means it takes about 500 measurements a second. So over 2 weeks, you end up with a few gigabytes of text file data. So we're looking at it. It's a lot of work to try and separate the signal from the noise, essentially. There's a big noise to signal ratio. So the answer is yes, we have looked at the data, but we don't have any results yet. So that's kind of like a 1 year time scale that we're looking at. It's been about 2 months. But, yeah.
Just a quick question on the scale they're going down in measurements, 200, the cyclical rising and lowering of the unit went down to 200.
Yeah.
Did you manage to get down to 1,000 meters? It's much more difficult.
It is, yeah. So the question is, how deep do we manage to get with the instrument? And so the region where we were, so remember let me go back to here. Let me go to a map. So we were right in this region here. So this is Banks Island, and this is Nunavut here. So we were right in this region in here. This is called the not the Mackenzie Trough. It's the Amundsen Gulf in here. And so the maximum depth there is about 400 or 500 meters, which is the deepest we went. So we didn't go into the deep Beaufort Sea, which we would have liked to have done. We would have liked to have gotten down to 1,000 meters because of sea ice. So essentially we have to stay away from sea ice. And though we had very low sea ice levels this summer, the sea ice was very fragmented, so that there were lots of pieces that were drifting around towards the edges. So even though there wasn't much sea ice, there was still a lot of small fragmented ice in these regions, and we had to stay away from it. So we actually didn't get to go into the region that we really wanted to, which was into the deep ocean. And yes, the maximum depth that we could, in theory, go is 1,000 meters. That's what the instrument is rated to. Yeah. Actually, if you're interested, it's actually more difficult to break through the top 100 meters than it is to break through the lower, between 100 and 1,000 meters. It's actually not that difficult once you can break through the surface, as long as the instrument can withstand the pressure. The most difficult part is the surface, because that's where you have the biggest density variation, right? Because you have nearly fresh water at the surface from sea ice melt, and you have quite salty water below that. And it's a big density difference, and to try and get through that density difference is quite difficult for an instrument. Yeah.
Okay.
Good? Okay.
Well, thank you for joining us today. The Vancouver Aquarium Marine Science Centre is a not-for-profit organization committed to conserving aquatic life. If you would like to support the aquarium and its programs, you can visit our website at www.vanaqua.org. Thank you.